Okay, sounds good. So let's start with that. Let's start with first level analysis. So I'm your questions directly, and then we can visit the quality assurance plots. Do you think they will be finished over the next few minutes or not? Or at least some of them might have already finished, so that we can perhaps take a look at those, or not yet?
I mainly just have some questions about the config file for first level.
Oh, okay.
What you mentioned about the QA plots is that you asked, are they finished running? They're
oh yeah, they're run. I just haven't. I just haven't gotten through. So I've run both the surface-based and the volume-based, and created the QA plots for both pipelines.
Oh, fantastic!
I just haven't had sufficient time yet to go through all of the plots. But would someone mind just going into the SEQ PDS folder? I don't have my machine with me today. Because I think it's just faster and easier to show people.
Okay, let me see if I can. Let me check if I have VGL thing open.
I have one running and I can share.
Oh, you have one running? Okay, we'll do yours then.
You've already run first level, right? So you probably won't have any questions about this. But...
Well, I have some questions about the first level config script.
Oh, okay. So maybe there'll be some overlap. Okay.
Okay, so where do you want to go to the config?
Yeah, for first level.
And then first level speech.
Yep. Yeah, so I noticed in the tutorial video that there was no model session up at the top. I'm just wondering, do I need that? And if so, what is that? Because I think I got this from the template that you were using for the rhythm study, but when I looked at the tutorial video, it wasn't there. I'm just not sure what that is.
The model session, yes, that's just for modeling session specific or session invariant effects. I think we typically set it to, let me remember how it works. I always get it switched on, but you're right. I think it's not in the design information.
I mean, I know that video was from a while ago, and so things might have changed.
Right.
So I want to confirm that that's...
Let me look at the so we have this Google Drive document, the FrankLab fMRI analysis thing. That let me check if that information is in there or not. Is model sessions? Yes, 1.0 estimate session specific. Default value is 0. 1 set to 0. SPM estimate session invariant. Okay, so set it to 0 if you want to have session invariant effects. So basically, just one effect across summarizes the effect across all of the sessions, which is the default behavior for our FrankLab pipeline. So if you just don't include that line, that's fine. It's gonna set it to 0 by default. Or you can set it to 1 if you want to have instead session-specific effects. So you can set it to a list of names if you want to specify which particular first-level columns basically you want to model as session invariant, and the rest will be session specific, because by default everything goes as session specific in SPM when creating the design metrics, and we want to have that default behavior change so that we use we estimate things that are session invariant, because that allows us to have very bad sessions with very few data points and that not messing our estimation step. So if you have something like that, like model session set to 0 or don't have that line at all, the behavior is the same. It's going to model session invariant effects for the effects that you care about.
Okay, perfect. Yep.
No.
So this is a sparse sampling paradigm. So the model basis is set to none. And well, I just have this like larger question about covariates. So I had some discussion with Frank yesterday about this. We've coded the behavioral data from both the scanning session and then the two behavioral pretests. And we want to try to see like, if we have some sort of like behavioral index of the degree to which subjects learn these non-native sequences, if we can use that as a covariate to see, if that is related in some way to the bold activity patterns. And I'm not sure like how I'll go about actually implementing that like within the.
Right, so it depends kind of like the level at which this covariate exists. Basically, is it a single number per subject, or is it a single number per session, or is it a single number per trial or per time point? So all of those cases.
A single number per subject, probably.
Okay, so single number per subject, those they are typically entered at the second level. So at the first level estimation, you don't care about those variables yet. You just estimate the subject specific, like the response to a speech minus baseline or whatever condition you care about. And then once you estimated those responses or maps of responses, spatial responses across the entire brain, then you enter those individual maps across multiple subjects into a second level analysis. And at that point, you can enter additional covariates that add additional information about those subjects. What were their ages and what were their IQ and mental state or whatever other variables that they represent basically individual numbers per subject, you enter them into your second level analysis. So at this point, you don't care about those. If on the other hand, you do have numbers that are like time series, like for example, you might have recorded like a lung volume, something like to heart rate, like a continuous time series that represents the actual heart rate, and you want to control for potential covariation of the Bold signal activation with those time series, then those are also covariates, but they are temporal covariates, and you can add them here when it says model covariates, that you can add individual files that contain this type of time series. That basically is anything that is a time series that is basically one number per scan, per acquisition. Those are the model covariates that you can enter here at this, where it says motion and art in your, you can also add in the other like manually defined ones. And those are just basically by entering a file name in there per, I think you need to enter a file name per run. So typically you have those individually enter as additional covariates in the subject-specific files.
I guess that makes sense that it would be at the second level too.
But yeah, if there is duration though, if you want, so you could have like the duration for every.
Right, and then you have something different like duration, which is a single number per trial, which might be a combination of multiple acquisitions, depending on your design, or it might be just one single acquisition if you have, it will be exactly equivalent of this type of model covariates. But if you have something like they are individual trials, like an event-related design, and you have numbers per event, then those are also another sort of covariates, and they, in SPM lingo, those are called parametric modulators, and then you enter them as, well, in here also you enter them as parametric modulators. Basically, you have a P-mod field. I don't know if you recall in the configuration files where you enter the information for each individual run, you can also enter this type of this P-mod, which corresponds to these parametric modulators, which is yet another type of covariation that you can have. In this case, it's basically one number per trial for whatever you're modeling as individual trials, which might be a whole block, or it might be an actual trial, like in an event-related trial type of thing.
What was the covariate you said you were interested in?
Like a measure of the degree to which they are learning novel sequences, performance gain, so like a measure of like a performance gain. Because actually, in the prior paper by Sagawa et al., like they found that was that the degree of motor performance gains was correlated with like white matter in the superior temporal auditory region. So we'll want to look at that in the stuttering cohort. But okay, that makes sense.
Right, so in this case, it sounds like it's going to be just a subject level covariate. So basically that will enter into the second level analysis, and you don't need to care about that yet.
So, and then just one last quick question. So like when I looked at the violin plots there, after I ran the pre-processing pipeline, like there were some outliers with regard to motion. Do we exclude those from first level, or do we?
It kind of depends on how severe they are and in which particular variables they are. So if they appear in you have two motion measures in those plots. One is the mean motion and the other one the max motion. So outliers in the max motion measure typically with we don't care that much about that as long as we are running art and we are making sure that we are removing those actual individual time points where there was excessive motion. But an outlier in mean motion, then it's more problematic because perhaps we haven't removed that many time points and the average motion of that subject is large. So it depends on how large that outlier was. Was it very far away from the rest of the subjects? Was a very high number? Was larger than 1 millimeter on average in terms of the mean motion? Or do you remember the size of those numbers?
Can we just pull it up?
Yeah, sure. I think there was just one that was like really
But
far
when you
out.
look
Right?
at the idea for
Can you look at it for the
max
surface
motion,
based?
right, Alfonso, is that those are the violin plots report the subjects that had higher max motion, but trials are removed where that motion when the emotion occurred, right?
Right, exactly. So we could have, if you use art with the default settings, anything that is above, I think, 0.9 millimeters in terms of scan to scan, so one acquisition to the next acquisition motion gets removed automatically, or basically gets labeled as an outlier, which as long as you enter the art, as in this case, in the listed in the model covariates field, is going to be entered as additional regressors into your SPM, so they're going to be effective.
Surface based version 3. Yeah.
Is it called? Do you need the star? Do you need the star? Stars.
Oh, maybe you don't need it.
I find here I always have to put in one subject name.
Is it SQPDS 03? That's not the subject, that's the actual study code, right?
SQPDS.
I think if I put in,
01, maybe?
Just an asterisk.
I tried the asterisk and it didn't work.
Could you just enter, instead of keyword plots, enter a list and then the name of the first subject? So just the same as change keyword plots to list and change SIGPDS to SIGPDS and the actual fill in the 01 something C03, I think, or something.
CO3.
CO3.
Yep.
So that's okay. So it does include the surface space V3 pipeline. It says no first level analysis. That's fine. And remove the surface space V3 thing, just to have a list of all of the pipelines that were run for this subject. So
sorry, with field maps. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. That's how. So the list thing. I don't know if I explained it in any of the things that we were showing before, but the list is just to list you can use it to list individual subjects for one experiment, or to list individual pipelines for one subject, or individual first level analysis for one particular pipeline.
Tell me if there's a typo because my screen is
So I think that's fine.
Are you sure the star is supposed to be there?
no star wins.
No star wins.
Okay, so is it this guy?
Oh my.
Yeah. And that's
Well,
max
that's
motion, not mean motion, so maybe that's not problematic then. Okay.
I can run
Right, and the mean motion, I don't quite see. It's the fourth column is the mean motion.
The fourth one is the mean motion, yeah.
And could you browse the mouse over the highest point in there just to see the value? What number does it say in there?
1.27?
Okay, so that's relatively high there.
2775.
Okay, so that's a bit high. Right, it's and it has removed a lot of. So the first one, I think, is the number of valid scans, right? And could you just browse over the first, that same subject is the lowest in the first violin plot, the lowest thing.
The first one.
Yeah.
The one on the left.
Yeah.
Furthest left. And on the bottom.
Yeah, on the bottom, the low, the one, just to see how many, and it says 133 valid scans in total over and the rest of the subjects just browse over the rest of the subjects, just kind of like to see the range. I don't quite see the numbers, so I don't see what the range is. It's 300 and something.
O2P16.
Okay, so yeah, it sounds like a lot. So it has removed close to half of the data points for that subject, and it shows a lot of motion. So I don't know. This is one of those problematic subjects that you can keep, but keep an eye on it. And if the first level measures are just very noisy and bad, perhaps we should remove it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's borderline enough to be kind of like not obvious that we should remove it, but also not obvious that it's not going to affect anything because it has very few. So those two subjects that have the lowest number of valid scans and have the highest values for the mean motion are probably the two to keep in mind, just to make sure that they are clean. They look relatively clean data when we get to the first level analysis, just to decide later whether we want to remove them or not.
I have a question. This is a this is a sparse sample design. How many runs is a given subject have?
8. And each run has 40 trials.
Gotcha.
Okay.
I'm gonna say like 250. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Good.
I think those are all the questions that I had.
Right, and the fact that you don't see that in the average, so it doesn't show up as high values in the global signal. So the two on the right, they show you the amount of change in the global signal from scan to scan. So typically when you see a lot of motion, you also see a lot of global signal changes because it creates some artifacts. But in these cases, you don't quite, doesn't seem to correlate with high values in that. So that might give us some hope that perhaps it's not necessary to remove those subjects. And the one that has this huge value in the max motion, that's fine. That's just some individual time points. You can actually check later if you want to that individual subject, look at the video. There's another quality assurance plot that shows you like a video of the functional data and then the potential outliers, and you will probably notice visually when that place happened and the subject moved quite a lot. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not the max motion what is problematic, but it's mostly the average, the motion. What is?
Can you go back to the config file? Oh, sorry, I thought you still had it open. Oh yeah, right there. Yeah, right here. I mean, do you think then at the level of first level, do I need to add any more covariates, or you think I just run it like that? Like, did you guys add any others to your studies, or?
So for what I feel like in the examples, at least for the model covariates, there's also the linear option that I know
right. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yes, and I don't recall the motion. Let me see. I think there are several options for motion that you can add.
Matt picked a more recent example and just copied in when he needed. But right, you have some examples that have that have PMOD. What is it? PMOD. What's the
Yeah, another thing that you can enter is motion plus deriv. So in addition to the 6 motion parameters, enter the first order derivative. So that makes about 12 parameters instead of. This information again is in the Google Doc, the Frank Lab fMRI analysis Google Doc, looking at the. Where it says the model estimation file, the configuration options, and it's listed under model covariates, all of the options that you can enter there.
So while we're looking at this, and I think this will help out as well in terms of figuring out the right options for these. So I remember when at one point you had suggested that for sparse sample design, don't model the hemodynamic response function.
Right, that's also a good point. The model serial is set to R1, so that there is also something that is not obvious that is the case if this is sparse sample design.
So yes, this is an old one for me.
Okay.
And the model basis is set to HRF plus derivative, which again, if this is a sparse sampling, it's not totally clear whether that should be entered, because that you can enter like a run.
It's called duration reg, no HRF.
You would use that if it was a continuous acquisition?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, just to clarify, the AR1 should also be gotten rid of for a sparse design.
If they are I mean, how far away they are, and are they consistent? So AR1 assumes an autoregressive model of order 1 for modeling the temporal covariation across time, and that basically assumes that all of the acquisitions are acquired at the same time interval. So this is like even if they are relatively large intervals, like 10 seconds or 12 seconds, that's fine, as long as they are always the same. But if they are not always the same because they might take some time or less, then AR1 is not going to be a good model, and as long as they are relatively far away, it's better just to set none and assume no temporal correlation in there than to have the wrong model. So I would, if this is what type of sparse sampling was it? How far apart are the acquisitions? Are they always the same distance or not?
So, well, oh yeah. So for mine, they're all 11.5 seconds between acquisitions. So I think that, so it sounds like that's okay. So
in that case, if they are always the same and are 11 seconds is far away, so that there's going to be very low temporal correlation anyway at that level, but it's not bad to have it modeled as an autoregressive model. So R1 is going to work fine. If there is still some level of correlation, temporal correlation is going to correct for that. Fine.
And then the other option that I think you had mentioned to change for sparse sampling design is the
model basis, right? The model.
The HPF instead, because it's by default set to 128.
Right, that's also a good point. Yes, because this, well, again, if this is if again high pass filtering is a sort of temporal linear transformation, right? So it again assumes that the samples are acquired at even intervals. If that is not the case, then you shouldn't do any type of high pass or low pass filtering. And you can, if in your case, since those are always constant, even though they are 11 seconds, well, the problem with high pass filtering is going to remove many of the things that are interesting because there is such a high period of sampling frequency. So yeah, in this case, I probably set it to inf as well, just to remove high pass filtering at all, because you don't want, even if the effect that you care about is going to be very much low frequency, you still want to keep it because that's the nature of your data. So yeah, set it to high pass filtering equal to inf, something like that, to avoid any sort of high pass filtering. And the other one is the model basis, right? The example that we were looking at before, the configuration file had the model basis set to href plus deriv, and that should be set to none if this is sparse sampling. So those are the three things, you're right, that should change basically for a sparse sampling.
All right, that's all the questions I had.
So then I had a question about adding a parametric modulator. Actually, could you share? Because I have pulled up on my screen. Could you share the Zoom?
Oh, yes.
So I can just share my screen. Sorry, I should have.
It's okay, I didn't do it before that, maybe.
Oh, yeah, that would actually be.
Why is that? Is that encryption? That why do you email so much slower?
Yeah.
Still sharing.
I don't want computer on. Or
No.
Do I hit join and then mute the microphone, or do I just? How do I do it without joining?
Can you continue without joining?
Yeah, just continue without joining.
Yeah. And then it will
Just
try it.
Exit.
Or just exit.
Continue it. Okay, continue. Gotcha.
Now let's just close the microphone.
Cool. Alrighty. So let me share. All right. Can you see that? I know it's kind of small, but so if we look at one of the session design files that I have, I've specified all the onsets and the condition So speech, rhythm, speech, normal speech, rhythm, speech, baseline, and then an error. And then I have a duration for each of them. And then I've added in this pmod flag that has small. The pmod flag has which conditions the parametric modulators apply to.
Perfect. Yep.
And then I gave it a name, mean syllable length. We could argue about whether that's what that's actually measuring, but and then a value for each of the onsets. And for the ones that did not, that were not affected, so the baseline ones, I just put 0.
You can, yeah, that's perfectly fine. Yes, a 0 works perfect.
Okay, cool. So then, I wasn't sure. So I know when I looked at Elaine's first level specific configuration file, for the contrast, there was this naming convention that was the condition X and then that parametric modulator.
Right, yes, that applies to this case as well. So basically, when you create these parametric modulators, these new conditions are going to be created for you, basically, which have the name of the individual condition names, then the X for times, and then the name of the modulator. So those are the ones that measure the amount of the correlation between the modulator and the ball signal within that particular condition.
So I was, so that's the interaction between those two?
Right, exactly. So you're going to get 2 additional, in your case, in that example, you're going to get 2 additional effects that you can enter into your contrast, and they're going to be named M speech X. What was the name of the? Mean time, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So if I, So now I ran them through the first level QA plots. And so I was just taking a look at the design matrix, and that might be helpful because to explain why you need that interaction term instead of just using those regressors themselves that are for those 2 conditions.
Right.
So, so, and one reason I was doing this was I was seeing, could you have one, could you put the parametric modulator in the session design file and then decide to use it or not? Or once you put it in there, it automatically creates that.
What you mean? Right. You could modify as part of the first level estimation. You could modify any of the values that you have entered. So before, basically. So what I would do if you want to have it still in the configuration file, in the initial configuration file, but then you want to have a new model, a first level analysis model where it doesn't basically enter those things, I would just enter as the pmod variable in there and set 0, 0, 0, 0. So you enter one additional line into the model estimation that says pmod 0, 0, 0, 0. It's gonna, the last time that it finds a field is the time that it sticks, basically. So in this case, the pmod field is gonna read the pmod 1160 the first time, but then when it gets overwritten, basically that field value by a new entry. So what you can enter you can modify it within the config file, but so if you don't want to have to do it in every config file that for every subject, you could just enter it into the first level analysis file, which is just a single file, right? The one that says the model estimation parameters. You can also enter there these values if you want. So you can enter pmod 0000 in there, and it's going to affect to basically any analysis that gets run through here.
So like in this config file, if I just entered pmod.
Right, exactly. So you could have like another config file like this, which is without any type of modulation, and then add the pmod 0000 there, and it will overwrite. Basically, this will overwrite whatever you have specified.
Yeah, because I wanted to try to run, or I was thinking of trying to run it with and without adding this regressor and see what the difference is. but then I have to go change my subject.
Right, exactly. But you don't want to change all of those individual files for every subject, so you can override it just in here,
Okay.
basically.
All right, that's good. Cool.
Yeah.
So taking a look at the design matrix for one of the subjects, very small. If I can make it bigger. But let's see.
I mean, this is strange. Have you zoomed on that image, or it looked like that before originally? No, it should look like that. So is the different length across the different sessions normal? Because it seems like the last
Oh
two.
yeah, so for this one subject, the last there was a break in the last run, and so I think we had to restart the session over again. Or something.
I see.
And
Okay, so the fourth run kind of got broken down into two. That's why you see those two small ones. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, okay, so this is not doing exactly what I wanted to do. No, let's just do that one. Okay, so the first 6 regressors on the left have to do with these. This looks like baseline.
Right, so you will have the 4 conditions that you created and then the 2 parametric modulator
and then
effects.
there's a parametric modulator for the normal and one for the rhythmic speech.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
if you were to use just the let's say normal minus rhythm in this case without doing the X mean syllable duration, what would that be doing, and why would that not be what you want?
So if I understand the question correctly, so you are asking if I just create a contrast file for this particular experiment design, and I just contrast the 2 conditions that I care, like a speech versus the 2 conditions that were actually entered as the P mode to be actually parametric modulator, enter the time variable as an additional parametric modulator. But I'm not contrasting the effect of the modulator, I'm contrasting the effect of the condition, right? And you're asking, what is it that measuring?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is measuring typically the same thing that you would measure in the typical contrast without any sort of parametric modulation, only that you have removed the parametric modulator are always orthogonalized with respect of the additional things. So you're kind of like measuring the average response within that condition for kind of like the average response time. So you assume that the response is going to change, the strength of the response for one particular condition is going to change depending on the response time, on the duration being larger or smaller across the different trials. And you're saying it's fine that some trials, that longer trials, are going to have higher activation and shorter trials are going to have lower activation for this particular condition. I just want to know the average activation for that particular condition for the average duration. And then the same thing for the other conditions. So you are comparing for the average duration within each condition, what is the average ball signal response in those individual conditions. And you're comparing the 2 of them. Make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. So then
the way that happens is because SPM actually internally orthogonalizes anything that you enter as parametric modulators. So even if you didn't actually center the temporal covariate, the times are not centered to have like an average value of 0, right? Which is what you would expect for a typical contrast like this to be measuring so that the contrast that the residual contrast is looking at the average effect. You typically would have to center the temporal covariate for that to happen, but the SPM is actually doing that internally. That is why the interpretation of the other covariate, the baseline level, is the average duration in this case, the average value of the covariate.
So then maybe stepping back to sort of what we were talking about in lab meeting. Mm-hmm. So would controlling for something like syllable duration or mean syllable duration that is systematically different between the rhythm and the normal conditions, would controlling for that with these 2 different separate regressors, would that eliminate any effect of the different conditions compared to one another? Or maybe just what would be the best way to, if I wanted to eliminate something, is there a way to is there like the syllable length that there's potentially one effect in one condition and one effect in another condition, and I wanted to get rid of it, but not get rid of the any differences that there might be between the two conditions. Is there a way to do that, or is that just...
Right. I think that, let me think about this for a second. So in general, the way we've been approaching this is that, well, let me think about it for a second.
But,
This is the $1 million question.
yeah.
So I'll have to double check, because now that I'm talking about this internal orthogonalization that SPM does, makes me rethink what I thought was the status of the answer to this question before. So I'll have to double check with the code just to make sure that this orthogonalization is happening and it's actually affecting the things in the way that I think it does. But if I'm correctly, so my guess would be that the way things is done, if I'm not misthinking it, then because SPM internally orthogonalizes the effect of these covariates, of these parametric modulators, then it never controls in the way that we don't want it to happen in this case. So basically, if there are differences in the duration across the two conditions, those differences in duration are going to be disregarded in terms of the parametric modulator, and they are going to be all subsumed by the main condition effects in the way that we want. So basically, we wouldn't be controlling for that effect, just because the residual of the removing of the average value of the response time is happening within each individual condition separately. That's what I'm thinking that is happening internally. But so in any way, so in other words, since SPM will be comparing, so when you're doing the contrast and comparing condition A to conditions B, then you are comparing condition A for the average response time for that condition versus the condition B for the average response time for that condition. So if those response times are different, then it's fine, because you are looking at the average response time across the two conditions, even if those are different, and those are being subsumed into the contrast that you care about, into the one on the left that is not modulated.
But that might not be what we'd actually want, because if we're
exactly, because if we actually want to control for that, I mean, the way that we were thinking about this before is that if we want to actually control for potential difference in duration across these two conditions, then we simply don't mean center each individual time points, and that will take care of it. But I think because of this internal orthogonalization that SPM does, this might not be doing what we want it to do. So I'll have to double check the code just to make sure that I'm telling you the right thing. I mean, we can always change it because this is happening. Let me check. This is happening internally. Right. This is perhaps I'm entering. I have to look at the code to be able to answer that question. So we want to be able to do both things. We want to be able to enter those parametric modulators and remove any potential covariation in the ball signal that covariates with duration and not with things that we care about. But we want to be able to do it in two potentially different ways. One that actually controls for potential difference in the duration across the two conditions that we care about, and one that does not control for the potential, or does not basically orthogonalizes with respect of potential difference in duration across the two conditions of interest. Wow, that was loud. So I want to double check the code to make sure that we can actually do those two things, and if not, I'll change the code so that we can.
I can imagine that if the modulator was one regressor and it didn't discriminate between, let's say, rhythm and normal conditions, then the difference between normal and rhythm conditions.
Right, but then you would be assuming that the effect of the duration on the ball signal is the same across the two conditions. So we want to assume that the slope of the association between duration and ball signal might be different across the two conditions, but we want to still be able to decide what to do with the intercept of those lines. We want to be able to compare the center value of those regression lines, or compare the same intercept across those two regression lines. So, but we still want to be able to or at least have the model assume that the slope of those two regression lines is different. So basically, the association between the ball signal and the duration variable within each condition might be different, the level of association. So, but it all depends on how this is implemented. So that's why I need to look at the code. If I think we are basically sending this information to SPM, and SPM is internally orthogonalizing these things. So if that is happening and we want to have control over which thing exactly we do with the answering your question, then we'll need to modify that so that we skip basically this orthogonalization of SPM, or we cannot do it manually. We could create these additional columns ourselves, basically, and decide at that point whether we want to remove the average of the response time variable within each condition or across both of conditions simultaneously. And that would allow us to actually do what we want, basically, be able to control for the covariation with duration without removing the potential difference in duration across the two conditions that we care about. So I'll take a rain check on this and look at the code and tell you, send you an answer more specific later on that question.
Yeah. It seems like want to get rid of
Would be
where the effect that rate has is the same.
Yeah,
in both conditions.
Right, that's true.
That's what you're trying to get rid of.
Right.
And then presumably there could be like whatever different about the rate, but it's still rate dependent in the two conditions. Or between the two conditions. I actually kind of want to leave there.
Right.
So
So if you were to if we were to do it,
it's getting worse instead of better.
If we were to do this as like Elaine has been doing this, where you specify those contrasts, where you have that interaction term, would that be doing effectively controlling for rate across all those conditions that you're contrasting?
Well, no, those contrasts actually measure the interaction. Basically, if you enter a contrast that says, for example, condition A, X response time minus condition B, X response time, then you are looking at those interaction terms. Basically, you are looking at the interaction between response time and condition. In this case, you are asking the question of whether, well, we know that the response time is associated with the ball signal, and we know that, and you are asking the question of, is the level of association of the ball signal and response time different across the two conditions? So basically, if you think of the data as being fit by two regression lines, basically one on the x-axis you have the response time, the duration measures, right? So this is seconds. And on the y-axis you have ball signal. And then you have two lines because one is for condition A and one is for condition B, right? And then the question that you're asking with that contrast is whether the slopes of those two lines are different. Or you're asking, is the association between the duration and ball signal different across the two conditions? So that's like the interaction of duration and condition effect.
So that sounds like not something that we would want to be asked.
Right. Typically, what you care is the other thing. You care about the main effect of conditions. So you want to compare the condition A minus condition B after you have entered into the model these things. So they have already taken into account the covariation between the ball signal and duration. And then you want to still, so basically you are comparing the centroids of those two slopes, right? So you have two regression lines and two clouds of data points in the duration by ball signal axis that you are plotting, and you are comparing the centroids of those two things, whether they are different in height. And you assume that they are potential difference in the x dimension, so in duration across the two conditions, across the two clouds that you are measuring, but you want to evaluate whether they have different heights, basically whether the activation in one condition is higher than the other one. So you do that just by comparing condition A minus condition B without the x duration thing.
But then where do you specify that covariate?
The covariate is already entered. So if you look at the design matrix, it will look something like that. You will have the columns that correspond to condition A and the column that corresponds to condition B, and you will have additional columns that correspond to the covariation, right? The condition A by duration and the condition B by duration. So those have been taken into account by these additional columns. And when estimating the condition A effect and the condition B effect, is doing that knowing that some portion of the ball signal that is actually measuring correlates with condition A, with the level of duration of the individual events in condition A, and some portion of the ball signal variability covariates with the duration of the condition B, right? Makes sense?
So just by having the P1 in that session design file.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear it. Could you repeat it?
So I guess I just want to clarify, as in terms of the config files, where exactly we're specifying the covariate. So I have it in the session design file. I have the P1 info per trial, and then my first level config file, I have all the X movement time. But if I pull out all of that, the interaction terms, the first level.
You can add it as a.
Account for it.
So you have the individual subject.
It might be better.
I think it sounds like ultimately what we want to figure out is the best way to remove the effects of some covariate, but not look at an interaction term unless
Right.
that's doing.
In that case, you want to do what you're doing basically, which is to enter as additional parametric modulators in the, so basically all of the config files where you have onset information and all of that, you enter the pmod stuff, and then you enter the actual values of the thing that you want to control for, but then the contrast file in the first level analysis config files, which is basically one single file per analysis, right? It's not one file per subject. Those other things where you specify the contrast that you care about, then you don't need to care about, you don't enter anything about the parametric modulator. You just enter the name of the individual conditions. And those, by virtue of the original first level models having been informed about the duration of the different trials, those will be already controlled for. So you don't need to change anything in the configuration file that specify the contrast names. So basically these ones, you don't need to change this. This is perfectly fine as it is. Unless you do care about that question that I was saying before, basically the slopes of those regression lines, then you don't need to change this.
Can you see my screen right now? Or
Okay, let me see.
So I brought up the X-ray first level speech. So it's like
Right.
normal vascular stress.
Right, normal
And here I
phase.
have the interaction with the MT, which is movement time.
I see what you mean. Right, fast minus normal, and you have fast and you don't have fast minus normal without the empty covariation. Fast minus baseline, clear minus baseline, stress minus baseline. Right. So you could just, what I would do in this case is basically copy those three lines and just duplicate them, one with the modulator effect and one without the modulator effect. So what that is going to do is the ones without the modulator effect are the ones that you typically care about. But in addition, it's also going to allow you to look at the contrasts. It's going to create some additional contrasts that actually look at whether the slope, basically the covariation with duration, was different across those conditions. And you can decide later on whether you want to look at those results or not, or you want to consider them. But yeah, exactly, something like that.
But it kind
So,
of sounds like we're really not interested in those.
if you are not, I mean, all of that you are doing here in the contrast field is specifying what things you are asking SPM to estimate for you. Every line is a different analysis, basically. So SPM is going to create a different contrast for you, and it's going to output a different cone image and a different SPMT image, and all of that for every row of these metrics that you enter. And then you decide which ones you want to look at, or which ones you want to enter into your second level analysis, right? You're going to have, in this case, let me see, 4, 8, 11 contrasts that have been defined. So for every subject, you have 11 images that you're going to be looking at. And those 11 images mean different things. You have to decide then later on which one is the one that you want to enter into your second level analysis. In this way, by being very explicit and entering every contrast that you can think of, you are making sure that you don't have to rerun this contrast later on. You are just, every contrast that you think you might be interested in analyzing later on is going to be already computed for you. So then you decide which one do you want to enter into your analysis.
Just to be clear, if we don't want to compare the effect of MT
right.
on these conditions, then we wouldn't include it
necessarily.
Right. We wouldn't need to care about it. Right?
So yes, I mean, if you really don't care about the different slopes across the two conditions, which in most general scenarios you don't, then you can remove the lines that say from 10 to 12, and everything will be exactly the same. It's not that anything will change. I mean, the different contrasts that you have estimated will look exactly the same. You won't have these additional contrast images that you know that you don't want, and they are just like trash. So you are saving disk space, but you are not changing anything else, basically.
I think we're just trying to make it as specific as possible so that at some point in a few months we don't turn around and look at it again and be like, oh yeah, this looks like it's doing what I think it's doing, you know.
Well, and I do think we need to have like an explicit description of what each of these things is doing, because I have like a general feel for what we're talking about here, but an hour from now or an hour after the meeting, it will start to lose it. That sense. But and I just wanted to mention something about it, because part of the reason that we came up with this way of doing things was to accommodate something that we're trying to do with the S-rate study that ultimately, I don't know if we really need to do it, but it was that you would say, okay, for the speech minus baseline, like any of the just speech versus baseline contrast here, we don't want to remove the effect of duration. But when we look at a comparison of any two given speech, we didn't want to, and the way that that had been done in the past was you actually had like two completely separate first level analysis pipelines that you would pull from. Well, maybe we can combine that here. So now that we're going back to something that's actually is more intuitive to me, when I look at those design matrices, where if you have a column in there that is say duration for a given condition, that it's going to act like any of the other covariates that are listed, like non-condition covariates that are listed there, where it will remove the variance into that.
So then even if speech minus baseline,
Right.
it will be
It's already controlled. So this speech minus baseline is removing the effect of the speech duration, right? Like normal minus baseline is getting rid of variation due to the duration of the
Right. It's kind of estimating the speech effect at the average level of duration, basically, of all of the trials.
Okay. Which, a couple of months ago, I might have argued that we didn't want that, but now I don't care.
I don't think it matters as long as we know what it's doing. Because a couple of months ago, our understanding that it was doing the opposite. So, we thought that within one config file, I could have certain contrasts that were controlled.
Right.
So it's important that it's documented.
Right. And I don't. So, but what I also don't know now is like, we've sort of lost the use case here. If we decide that we don't care about removing that effect from, say, the normal speech condition.
But we just need to run a second. Like I would just need a second config file where I would.
First level analysis.
Right.
And I think I also have the answer to I haven't checked the code yet, but I'm pretty certain that this is going to be like orthogonalized because that's the way SPM does it. But I think we have a workaround to actually be able to remove the things that we care about. So this particular analysis, the way that is defined now, where we are entering the covariation with duration, but we are allowing that covariation of duration to be different across the two conditions, and then we know that we are going to be looking at the average response within condition, within fast versus stress speech, at the average duration level of each individual condition, whether those are different or not. It's only gonna control for the potential covariation between the ball signal and duration at a level that is not actually removing what Frank basically was concerned that it might actually remove the data that we care about, which is the difference between the two conditions. So the way we are doing it now is just because we are looking at the average duration, basically we are calling the stress response to a speech, basically the stress response to a speech at the average level of duration for the stress condition, and the fast response to a speech, we are calling that the average ball signal at the average level of duration for that condition. If those average level of duration for the two conditions are different, then those fast minus stress contrasts are not going to be affected by that. Yeah. So we are not controlling for that in a way that is dangerous. But if we actually do want to control for that in a way that might effectively remove some portion of this, because we want to show that actually the difference that we see between stressed and fast are not due to the potential difference in duration, but they are actually uniquely basically orthogonal to that, or they are different from that. And you want to actually control for potential difference in duration between the both fast and stress. Then the way to do that manually in our configuration files would be by, instead of entering two parametric oh wait, sorry about that. Oh, nah. Then sorry. Now I confuse myself and I have to look at the code again, because I was thinking offering you one trick to solve it, and I just thought, no, that is not going to work. It's actually the opposite way. Okay, so forget about everything I said. I'll look at the code. I'll give you an answer to that.
If we were to center the parametric modulators differently, such that
yeah,
assessing one condition at one if let's say rhythm is always slower than normal, and if you wanted to assess them at the same duration, if you
Right.
center them differently, such that one is centered at, like if they're both centered at,
If they are both centered at the same level, then you are controlling for the potential difference. So that's the way to do it if you want to actually remove potential effects that have to do with potential difference in the duration levels across the two conditions. But in order to, and if you want to not control for that, then you center them separately, basically. So you can center them separately for each condition, or center them jointly across the two conditions. But I need to check at the code to figure out where the centering is happening. Is happening at the level of SPM, or is happening at the level of our design specification, to be able to tell you how to actually, in the configuration files, specify those two options of centering, of differential centering, basically. Sorry about that.
So, I mean, I'm kind of wondering now if I need to do this, right? Because clearly there are whopping duration differences between like practice versus novel, non-native sequences, right?
well, that might be one instance where it would make sense to do that, because you're not trying to look at an effect between two things that are inherently.
Sorry, could you repeat the case example in your data? Sorry, Matt.
Comparing like novel versus practiced speech sequences, non-native sequences.
And you want to control for potential difference in
Utterance duration.
Right.
So speakers, motor
Right.
performance gain will show motor performance gains and produce the practice items faster compared to novel ones. But just like, I mean, more theoretically speaking, though, I mean, like they are produced slower, and so do we want to? I mean, so that's going to affect the neural activity, and do we want to be able to see that? Like,
right. I mean, the question is, I mean, by actually looking at examples of ball signal activation across different potential durations, we can actually tell how much the activation at one particular voxel covariates with duration. And we can say, well, I don't know, for every second we get like a 1% signal, ball signal higher activation for the longer durations for every additional second in the duration. So once the model figures out that relationship, it can actually try to control for that across the two conditions and say, well, we are finding the level of activation of 5% across these two conditions that we care about. But we only see an average activation difference of 1 second between the two of them. So those 5% of ball signal changes between the two conditions might not be actually an effect of just the difference in duration between those two conditions. So that's basically what the model can do for you. Basically, it can look at the overall difference in activation, and it can say which portion of that can actually be due just to the difference in the duration between the two conditions, and which portions are unique to beyond that. Basically, are actually those which difference across conditions cannot be explained just purely by difference in the duration across the two conditions. Make sense?
mm-hmm.
That seems like kind of what we really want here. So
Yeah.
you look at the condition effect, and you also look at how the variation due to a variation in duration, variation in the duration, the difference in the variation conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, but that, like, so rather than just trying to remove the effect outright,
Right.
we want to look at the effect and then look at the likelihood, like try to make an assessment of this new duration itself or some sort of interaction.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I need to do this then. Should I?
I don't know. I guess first you got to, so
At first level.
I think we need to act like we need to sit down and actually write down all of these things. So
Yeah.
we can make sure we're talking about the same thing. And that way what we're talking about. Because what's happening here, we're talking about this stuff, trying to think about how this all fits in. Or I think about now. And then I'm not 100, I just don't feel like 100% should do something.
Mm-hmm.
It'll also be nice for people who aren't in the secret brotherhood of have received Alfonso tutorial training that this cycle won't have to start again every 3 years when someone new enters the lab.
Yeah. So maybe, Alfonso, maybe if when you look at the code, could you like write some text to describe what the two different types of controlling for that we talked about.
Right, but I mean, once I look at the code, I'll just figure out how to actually implement it in our version of the code. But I can make it in whatever way is actually you think it makes more sense. So to you, what I mean, it eventually is going to boil down to basically something like, I don't know, if you want to control for that, create it as a single parametric modulator. But while if you don't want to control for that, create it as two parametric modulators, one per condition, or something like that. But,
whatever. I guess we'll kind of think about like what the simplest thing is. But what would be handy is if you took something like rhythm study or Matt's the SEQ PDS study, and we just had sort of like some examples, like a short document that was like, okay, you do it this way. This is sort of describe it in some technical detail, maybe whatever is needed, and so this is what we're doing, and then say, okay, so what we're doing is saying we're looking at the effect of, we're trying to remove the effect of the duration that's not different between two effect duration that is the same between the two conditions. So whatever's left over is going to be the duration that's associated with the two, like specifically the condition, something like that. So, and the other one is just now. Well, what we're doing is we're just removing. We're looking at, I guess, we're estimating each condition at the mean level of duration. So basically, just talk with, if you could create the scaffolding for that, then maybe some on our end we can try to flush it out, and you can just tell us where we went wrong.
right, I can create an example like of two configuration files that would do basically two different type of control and try to explain in a few words basically what those two type of control would do, and then you can tell me basically what type of design would make more sense, because this is a little bit. It's perhaps not going to be totally intuitive as to how you code it, because many of the things in here are relatively intuitive. Right? If you want to look at the contrast between two conditions, just say one condition minus the other or something, and that makes sense. And we try to make sure that it's as simple and as intuitive as possible to actually define these things. But I cannot yet think of a intuitive way to basically specify that information into our configuration file. So if you can think of that, basically, what would be the simplest way, or the way that it will be obvious to anybody who create these configuration files, that they should use one option or the other. And then I'll work on how to basically take that configuration information and put it into the whatever math is for the design information with SPM.
It's not so much yet at the level of but a very conceptual example of if you want to control for a variable in a certain way and it has this effect on some data.
Right, right, but control.
Necessarily, just in actual statistical terms, what's the
a paragraph on method 1 and a stored paragraph on method 2, and then we can kind of see where we fit in, and then we would meet and discuss again and come up with how it would fit. Because I think putting Python, at least, I don't think that's our issue right now, and I think it doesn't have to be intuitive as such, as long as we can document it. But I don't think that we even know exactly what it is that we need to do.
Right. So I would like something where I could go home or into my office and just stew on it for an hour or two, and then really feel like I wrap my head around the two different things that we're talking about. And not just wrap my head around it, be able to connect it, like be able to converse with people using a language, like using terms that we're all. Yeah. start out. Matt, any Matt, would like to do as an fMRI study like this. You might want to remove the effect of duration from, or you may want to do this other thing. That's the thing. Like every time I try to think of the other thing, I describe it differently because I really don't have good enough on it. Certainly nowhere near not good enough grip to actually make a suggestion for how the configuration file should be specified so that it would be easy to sort of.
Is this something that you guys did in the Sagawa et al. 2015 paper?
We in that one, I think we used basically correlation. So for a subject, so we took subjects learning performance, like some measure of how well they learn, and then use that as just a correlate at the second level to see.
But I mean, utterance duration.
I don't know if I don't remember if it was utterance duration.
If that was used as a covariate.
I think it was duration, but
But not at first level.
right. So it wasn't. We didn't use it for each.
So there's nothing preventing me from running first level at this point.
No.
Okay.
I don't think
Okay.
so.
I'm on like a really tight timeline and I want to make sure I have a result as soon as possible.
Don't worry about that.
Okay. Okay.
First level.
Okay. Okay.
Because, well, I think the way that we've been thinking about it, which is probably the most useful thing to do, which is basically just removing the effective duration. I don't think we want to do that.
No.
But because again, it's gonna be fitting rid. But then there's this other thing we now talked about, which is what you and sort of were doing without us really realizing, right? It could be useful, could potentially be useful, but it could not be because it may be just that I don't understand the two things well enough, which is what we need to. That's what we need here, I think. Or I shouldn't speak for it, but I can.
No, I think you got it.
Yeah.
I'm not sitting here, feeling superior and going, well, I understand everything. There would be no use for that.
Yeah, and I think to sort of summarize like what we're in need of is that you know a lot about how to if it's possible to and how to ask all of the questions that we can come up with, and but I think we don't know. We are not as versed in all of these things. So while you might be able to make it possible for us to do certain things, we wouldn't know what that means conceptually, like in statistical terms.
And the clear proof of that is that we sat down and talked about this, what Elaine did, and we described it in a way that we thought was accurately reflected what we thought it was doing, but we were wrong. It was not doing that. Alfonso, you knew what was happening, and the way we're describing it sounded like what you thought we wanted, and you weren't able to read our minds.
Yeah.
And even if you had, it would have just muddled and confused us. So that's what we need to I think we need to step back here, and because it seemed to me that in the past we have done something like this, but it was much simpler. Like the way it was doing the first thing, like the thing here that's not with the top by MT. It's doing the thing without it. You're just basically regressing out.
Right. I mean, part of the complexity here is because we try to make sure, or I try to make sure that that we could do basically everything in a single model, right? That we could enter all of the information into the design and then decide later at the level of the contrast, what is it that we care about, and do we want to control or not for things, and have a way to actually do that. But that might effectively, I mean, what I'm hearing is basically that is a level of complexity that we, in most cases, is not necessary. What you basically want to have is the ability to be able to add something that you want to control for or not, basically. And you can live with creating different models where you actually enter that additional thing when you want to control for it, and don't enter it when you don't want to control for it. And that is simple enough, right? Or
I think that makes sense.
But when you say control for, I think that even that.
Right. Well, I'm trying to use control for is a complicated word, right? Because many people think of them different. So control for, right. I'm thinking of it in the way that people like the typical psychology student think of it. So basically, you are trying to compare two groups, two population heights, right? And one patients and one control. And you are trying to see whether the height of one group is higher than the other one. But then you realize that, well, one group is older than the other one. And perhaps the difference in height that we are measuring is just because some of them are older, some of them are kids, and some of them are just older people. And we don't care about that. I mean, we know that the older you are, the higher, the more you grow and you are higher. But that's not what we care. We care about the difference in height between population and between patients and controls at the same level of height. Can we compare that even though our samples have different heights? That's the typical, so the way people think about that is say, well, just give me the difference between the two groups in height, controlling for age. That's what people like psychology type of framework thinks of that in terms of control. Controlling is like a magical way to remove the influence of something that take into account that the thing that you are measuring is going to be confounded by this something, and you want to make sure that it's not confounded by that. Is that basically what you are thinking of when you are trying to control for duration, or is something else, basically?
Well, that's what I was thinking, yes. Although, which is separate to say that, that's a separate question then, is that the best way to do it? But that is how I was thinking of it. Is it safe to say, if I were to say, just go back to how we talked about this earlier, that when you do that, you're getting rid of the effective age that is essentially the same across the two groups. But if you were to do it this other way that we've talked about, what you would, and when you do that, so you're preserving the effective age that is unique to the two groups, right? So.
Right. I mean, this other way that we've been talking about is a way that doesn't actually control for age difference between the two groups. This is something that just controls for potential covariation between age and height that might be different in patients. In this case, would be something like okay, perhaps the patients don't grow as fast as controls, right? They just they grow slower, so they get the rate at which height is changing with age is different between controls and patients. And we want to take that into account and look at the difference between patients and controls in height. And we don't care about whether we actually had different heights. We assume that the two groups were roughly the same size, the same age across the patients and controls were roughly the same age, the two groups. But we do care about those differences we know that the height measure is going to be confounded or at least correlated with age. And we know that the age is going to, the rate at which age is changing height might change in patients versus controls. We just want to control for that that's kind of like the other way of controlling. We just want to take that into account when estimating the average height level and comparing the average height between the two groups. We want to just, our model take into account that the actual age information also is another factor that affects height, and it's a factor that affects height in a potentially different way across our two groups. But we don't want to control it in the way that we were thinking about before. We don't want to control it as to control for potential average difference in height between the two groups. We want to just take it into account. Our model have that additional information into account when estimating the average height of each group. That's the kind of like the other way of controlling it for that we were talking about. In this case, how it applies to the psychological like height patient controls. But it's more complicated and it's less common. Right. I mean, here, that's why we were thinking about this. I was saying before, the slope of the duration and ball signal. That's kind of like the contrast that you were looking at is actually estimating those slopes. The slopes in this case would be basically the rate of change in height with age. And you want to test whether those rates of change in height with age are different between the two groups. That would be the contrast. In our case, that would be something like a stress times MT minus normal times MT. It's telling us whether the rate at which bulb signal changes with duration, is it different in the stress condition versus the normal condition. Does it make sense?
A bit more. I actually quite like this age and height example.
Okay, perhaps I can use it as an example.
Psychology students.
Yeah.
Probably don't have to.
But is it? I just wonder, just because I think we are still struggling with it, or at least I am, in terms of I just can't fully picture what the output will be from the second version. But would it be possible to even just do like a small like simulation of, made up data, and then if you do it this way, this is what it looks like. If you do the second way, this is what it looks like. Because it's just not concrete for me yet.
Right. So yes, perhaps I could make up some data for this and for some simplified version of this, like duration and just two conditions and duration. And
what's kind of nice about that is with our current data sets, they're so complex that it can be difficult to. There's so much going on. It can be difficult to tease apart this, one version versus the other. But if we just had, 20 data points in one group, 20 data points in another group, I think we'll be able to clearly see what is happening to data when we do analyze the two different.
And I think that it's an important thing for us to wrap our heads around, and for us to have a clear idea of how to analyze it, because all the studies that we're talking about here are, I think, in the original SEQ study, although I don't think we didn't give it this much thought at that time, is that we're modulating these things that we think that if we weren't purposefully modulating them, if it was just the subject modulating them, has an effect on the whole response. So we know that there's going to be just variation in these things, like duration, whatever else is going to affect the whole response. But we are also, the task itself is meant to manipulate those behaviors or covariates. So it's important that we figure out a way to try to control for the differences and yet not remove the effects, the condition of task effects.
I think normally that comes down to experiment design.
Right, but unfortunately,
unfortunately we got the data.
And I also don't know how big a deal this. It's not clear to me how big a deal this is. And I think that one of the things, to go back when Matt brought up the SEQ study and Alfonso started to address that, it seemed like that was starting to provide a way for us to determine how big a deal it was. So you could this voxels here actually do seem to be more primarily driven by just the duration, regardless of the task, where these voxels over here are modulated by duration, but that's tightly coupled to the task itself. I think that gives us a way to
right, and not only that, you could actually just have some difference between the conditions that only happen for the long durations and not for the short durations, right? So this type of interaction is something that conceptually also could be meaningful at some point, at some places, right? You could say, well, perhaps these voxels are actually showing a difference in the stress versus normal condition, but only for the long duration. It doesn't take into account for the short duration type of trials, right? And that could happen as well, and it's something that would be basically driven by the same type of models. Basically deciding how to implement now.
Okay, so going forward, I think everyone can just do it this way, where we're just either don't worry about it. For your sake, I don't know how big it is. Honestly, I don't know if it's a big deal. I really don't. But
or just sort of acknowledge and discuss it in the general discussion, that or
but and only if because you could say
There's problems with this. Alfonso.
you could say, you could look at the measure that Frank was talking about today. Does that differ across the groups? Because it's really like, it's the instantaneous rate that you're worried about.
Is it? Well, so I don't know if that's not what I was worried about.
I think that's what it should be.
The articulation
The
rate.
articulation rate. In terms of like, because the other part of the rate, I think, is exactly the thing that you're trying to find, differing between the two tasks.
Potentially. But there's other things that are varied between the rhythm and the normal condition that we can talk about offline.
Sure, but all of its parts, the whole idea here is really, it's really, you implement, you have subjects speak in this manner. If for whatever reason, it effectively reduces stuttering. So you just say, okay, that's that. So I think just looking at the straight task effects is reasonable. I think that so Elaine could switch to this, to doing it this way, and but then also still comparing it with and without and moving it, and Matt can stick with. Don't worry about it for the first level, and we can think about it at the second level.
Yeah. And we've just, like, we all have to move really fast. Like, March is not that far away. Like, I mean, it's really not. Like,
and you can always, when stuff is under review, people can get back to you and say, like, hey,
sure.
shouldn't you have done it that way?
Yeah.
And no matter which way you do it, that will happen.
Right.
So rather than kind of equivocate all of these things,
Yeah.
Stick with one thing.
stick with it, and then just.
Right, and one reasonable way is say, I don't care about this. This is going to affect my interest. What Frank was saying, these measures, the difference in duration, is going to affect our interpretation. But we are fine. I mean, we are fine with that. We are going to get our estimates, look at whether we see a difference in across conditions, and then we say in the caveats, well, we know that this difference may be affected, or at least partially affected, by difference in duration across the two conditions, or maybe not. I mean, that's how you interpret the results, and you can just live perfectly fine without actually modeling, trying to correct statistically for these things, or trying to correct across experimental design with these things, and just leaving it as potential confounders and in the interpretation of your results, which is a reasonable option. You just have to be able to defend it in terms of writing the paper, right?
Yeah, because
The reason for the rhythm study is because this study has been done before. It was done in 2011. It was published. There is by another group that's looking at the effect of rhythmic speech versus normal speech. One of the main reasons why we did it again was because they did not control for utterance duration. They did not even mention it. They didn't say how they were specifying it. So we specified it. We trained them to go within a certain speed, and all of the everything was within that narrow window. But there was this consistent effect where the rhythmic speech is quicker than the non-rhythmic speech, and it's possible to, or it's longer than the non-rhythmic speech. I can say that.
the thing is that every time you sample for every trial, you have a sentence that you're saying over some, like, a couple of seconds.
Yeah.
But when you sample every voxel, that's over some, like, number of milliseconds at one time slice, right in the middle of it. And then there's some, like, HRF added to that. So it's really, so the idea, so the idea is, so what you're thinking is there's something in your brain that's saying, make this whole thing shorter or longer.
Yes.
A top-down thing that says, make it this long. The total length of this is this long. Or the pauses, make the pauses this big.
Do we code for pauses? Does our brain control pauses, or is it just onsets?
You tell me. The way I think of it is that you have this, like, external rhythm that you're trying to apply to it.
Yeah.
And you do that.
Yeah.
Right? And then that's just happening. Right?
Right.
And maybe when we do this, when we sample the way we do, maybe we're capturing that. so that in one condition, you're not doing that. Something else is providing the pacing. And so something's active to a certain degree, and something else in the other condition, that is controlling the pacing. So that's this other brain region is active. But what you're not doing is, but then when you sample, you're just sort of grabbing something like that's happening at an instantaneous time. So that whole thing is sort of like been set in motion.
Yeah.
And
I think that's an excellent point.
And that's the thing that you actually want to find different. So what you might want to get rid of is if, I don't know, I guess, you could say like, well, because I think for the S-rate study, the idea was you're literally saying something fast versus slow.
Yeah.
And there was a big difference in duration. And so it's like, well, if you're saying something really fast, but so fast that it's actually, you get done really quickly, then maybe your motor cortex isn't going to be less active. So you'll see a difference in motor cortex that has nothing to do with the controller. It's just to do with the fact that these things were just on and being useful. But to be honest with you, that was also sensitive. So I don't know.
And I think in my case, it really just comes down to processing load.
Right, and yours, processing load. Yeah. So it's a little bit different, right? Yours is sort of the natural
working memory.
Right. So it's not like a top-down thing. So it's if you could say. I don't know where, how useful this stuff is, given that I can imagine all sorts of different ways that somebody can complain, but it kind of comes down to what you can actually measure with the fold response. And you could say, well, I don't know. I mean, because we could certainly do things, and we could find out which areas of the brain are correlated with duration. Yeah. Like Alfonso was saying, we could find like to what degree are they correlated with relation or with duration. And we could sort of provide some sort of idea that, well, this area, even though it shows up here, maybe it's not necessarily a top-down thing because it seems to be just related to duration no matter what. So, like, even within each, I don't know what it's, for both tasks, for both conditions, it seems to be modulated the same, just depending on whether or not they set it really quickly in the normal condition and in the rhythm condition, or not, or long enough. Very. I guess is that. So when I say the phrase it varied the same in both conditions, that's what I mean. I don't know if that's actually if that's like a reasonable way to phrase that, but does that make sense? Like that.
No, I think those are excellent points. Yeah, I mean, to really keep in mind. Well, no. I mean, because we get so like buried in the details, but you have to kind of like take a step back and really understand the nature of the bold signal. Like, what exactly are you?
That's
right?
true.
I mean,
that's true. I'm guessing that the amount that they differ by probably has little to no effect on that one snapshot that you're capturing for a whole sentence. All right. That actually makes a lot of sense. That you'd want to control for it if there were big changes. And if you could control for it, maybe you would try to control for it if there were big changes. But because we've made them, we've narrowed them so that the conditions are not quite the same, but they're close enough that we shouldn't reasonably expect there to be variation across those different phrase lengths or speed.
And if the duration is really small, like the difference between the duration across the two is really small, but I guess still significant. Yeah. Right. You could. It sounds like what Alfonso was saying is if you remove that duration effect this way, yes, the non-bi duration, right. That it would be removing just the effect of duration modulation within the conditions. No, I thought that was across it was the same
No, so that's the thing. I think what Alfonso is saying that is that, and Alfonso, tell me if I'm not representing accurately what you were saying. But when you add in that P mod and you know, part of the session design, and then you add in two separate columns in the design matrix, each of those columns is correcting for something different. One of those columns is correcting for duration for the rhythm condition. One of them is correcting for duration for the normal condition. But when you compare those two conditions, they'll still, or you're comparing them at the average duration for each of the conditions separately, right?
Yep, that is exactly right.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
I wasn't sure if he was going to be even still there.
I am.
But if we went back to the old way, like what it seemed like the old way that we used to do this, where you just had one column there that was the duration for every trial.
That would just get rid of the effect
of duration. Just duration, or
well, so if that regressor, if that had high values during the longer the rhythm condition, that would be the worst case in which you get rid of your effect. You completely control for it.
But then there's this other thing that we've talked about.
Right, but that's kind of like the stringent control that people think of, I think, in general, when they want to control for the effect of duration and control for potential difference in duration across the two conditions. That like single column case best represents what that control would entail, basically.
And that would not be the right thing to do because you would get rid of the effect of the contrast.
Well, it would be the right thing to do if you want to control for the difference, for the potential. If you want to say, well, I'm finding this difference in the activation level between these two conditions, and I want to make totally sure that that difference that I'm finding in activation across the two conditions is not due to potential difference just in duration across the two conditions. Then you would do exactly this control to show that your results are robust to controlling for potential difference in duration across the two conditions.
But you could potentially be getting rid of some of the effect of the conditions.
Yes, but to the degree that they are not totally orthogonal, I mean, these things are very collinear. If the effect of the conditions is very collinear with the effect of duration across the two conditions, because in one condition is incredibly high and in the other condition is incredibly low, and they are very consistent, then yes, those two effects are collinear and they cannot be estimated correctly, and then you will effectively be removing. You cannot properly estimate one effect controlling for the other, so you will find nothing significant in that. When you're comparing the two conditions with this control, you will find nothing significant, but not because you are removing something that wasn't really needed to be removed, only because those two separate things that you are trying to conceptually take apart, you cannot take them apart because they are very collinear in your data. So you cannot effectively, with a statistical significance, tell that one of those two things is in some particular direction. So you cannot tell that one condition is higher than the other because the system realizes that it cannot tell that apart from actually just the two conditions being different in the amount of duration. Make sense? So it's a problem in sensitivity, ultimately, not so much of the design.
Yeah. Right. So when you talk about this, like single column regressor versus two column regressors, they map onto these two
Conditions.
Like as in the two versions, like the IMT versus like not specifying it.
That YMT I think is a completely separate issue.
It's different.
That is saying you want to look at the differences in how duration affects each of the conditions. Like you want to compare those two conditions, but not just those not those two conditions specifically, but how duration affects each of those conditions, whether those are different.
So then,
well, isn't that what we want to do?
You want to see whether the effect of duration in rhythm is different than the effect of duration in normal speech.
That would be so. It seems like that's what we want to do. Is we're sort of interested in I guess what we want to do is keep that keep that variation in the two conditions, so that when we look at the condition effect, that will actually that difference will be represented in the two conditions. And then, but we want to remove the effect that is common to So the effective duration that is not correlated with the condition.
Right, but this is the level of contrast, and this isn't affecting the design matrix at all. This is just when you're comparing the different conditions. So whether you specify that or not won't affect whether you have another contrast that you've also specified that doesn't have that X time. They're just addressing two different questions. One of them is saying what's the difference between the conditions. One of them is saying what's the difference between the slopes of the effective duration on each of the conditions.
Sure.
So if the slopes are the same and you compare them, you're not controlling for how long or for the total duration or average duration in each condition. You're just comparing whether duration affects both of them separately or differently, whether there's any difference in how that affects it, which doesn't seem, and if there's not any difference, if, whether you're speaking rhythmically or normally, duration has the same effect, then that'll just be nothing. You won't get anything from that. Whereas if you were comparing the two conditions while potentially taking into account duration in the design matrix, then you would get the effect of the difference between those two conditions. And you might take away some of the variance that's due to you might take away, some of the variance that's due to the task because you're getting rid of this timing regressor that's correlated with that task. So I don't know if there's any question that we're asking in any of these studies that we would want to use that X for.
Well, I think though, I don't know, that specific implementation of this.
Sure,
it's
sure.
like at the contrast level versus design level.
Yeah.
Leave that
Okay.
aside.
Yeah.
But this idea, that we could find out where, how duration, an interaction between task and the covariate.
Right.
That would be useful information for us to have, I think.
Sure.
Because that's sort of it's okay, duration. There's basically duration being modulated. The effective duration that has nothing to do with the task, either the controller. Like some sort of top-down, let's consider duration is some sort of prosodic, parameter, or you're saying you have some part of your brain that's saying, say it this fast, say it this loud, say it with this timing.
Yeah.
So you would be interesting to know. I basically just repeat what I said before.
Yeah.
But you can get that information from that, right? You can see okay. I guess it's really the flip of it is that you want to keep that in there, but it would be interesting. So it's just like you could say okay, what are the voxels that are correlated with just duration, no matter what? You can look at that. That's built in here now, so we can just pull that out. And then you could say, okay, what are the voxels that differ with duration, but to a different degree in the two tasks? You can look at that too. That's what this would get you. Right?
So yeah. So when you say that that's built in there, so how would we actually just?
Yeah, I know you're not.
Oh no! I'm just.
I don't know.
No. I was just gonna ask Alfonso. So,
No, yes, but he's right. All of these are, you are getting it perfectly right. I mean, all of these options are possible to be estimated in the way that we are currently modeling. Go ahead, sorry.
If you wanted to just look at, okay, what's the effect of duration across both conditions? How would you do that? Or is there a good way to do that?
In the current version of the model, you would enter let me see, so stress times MT 0.5 and then normal times MT 0.5 or something like that to look at the average. Basically, because you're modeling the slope to potentially be different across the effect of duration to be potentially different across conditions. One thing that you could look at is the average effect of a slope across the 3 conditions or across the 4 conditions that you care about. So for that, you just enter the stress times MT, normal times MT, and I don't remember the clean times MT, and then enter a 0.33 for every weight for each of those individual effects, right? Just to look at the average slope, basically the average effect of duration. Is that the question?
Yeah, yes, and that makes sense.
So conceptually, I mean, I'm going to perhaps repeat something, but I'm going to see if I can make it a little bit clearer. When we have typically conditions and we care about the level of activation across the conditions, we think of the results as like a bar plot, right? If you look at a bar with an error bar, the level of activation response in one condition, and you compare it to the other one, and you are used to looking at those error bars and those bar plots and telling, well, activation is higher in this condition versus the other, and you can tell them apart by the difference of the bar heights compared to the error bars, right? When you have something else like a duration, then you need to add like an X dimension to that. So then you have like in the X-axis you have duration, and the Y-axis you still have the response. But now instead of like an error bar, you have basically a cloud, and you have two clouds now that you're comparing, right? You have like blue dots and red dots, and those are the distribution of duration and height for one condition, and the typical way to represent those would be by two clouds that you fit by two regression lines. And then you have to ask first at the level of the design. That's why like design and contrast are two orthogonal, well, separate questions. You have to first decide at the level of the design, how do you want to fit those clouds of data points? Do you want to fit them by two clouds that have the same slope, or do you want to fit them by two clouds that have potentially different slopes? And then if in the former case, if you force them to have the same slope, then what questions can you ask about those two things? You can ask whether the slopes, the two clouds have different heights in the centroids, or you can actually ask whether the height of those two slopes is the same at some particular level, basically because those are going to be parallel lines. You can tell what is the difference in height between those two lines, right? And then you can also ask whether the slope is positive or is zero or is negative. Those are the questions that you can ask at the level of the contrast. You're going to have an effect that measures the height of those clouds. Those are going to be the condition effects. You're going to have some effect that measures the slope of those clouds, and since you are fixing them to be the same, you're going to have just one like a duration effect that is going to tell you the slope of those two clouds. And those are all of the questions that you can ask. You can ask whether the height is different across the two conditions, or whether the slope is positive or negative. And then in the other case, where you can actually model, perhaps you are modeling the data as two clouds, but now you're allowing them, you're trying to fit them by two clouds that have different slopes, then you have some additional questions. You can ask whether the height of those clouds are different. That's the main condition effect. So basically activation in one condition is higher than the other one. And at the centroid of those clouds, you can ask whether the slopes are the same, whether the slope of one condition, the effect of duration in one condition is different than the effect of duration of the other. That's kind of comparing the two conditions. And then the only trick about that, which is why it's always very hard to get around, like how this case relates to controlling for in the control literature, is that when you have these different clouds with different slopes, when you are asking the question about what is the different height of those clouds, it depends on what you are thinking exactly, because they have different slopes depending at which level you are cutting it. If you are thinking at the left, perhaps one cloud is higher than the other, and at the right of the plot, because they have different slopes, then it's the other way around. So what is it exactly that you're asking when you're asking whether one cloud is higher than the other? Are you asking the question of whether the centroid of those clouds is higher than the other? Are you asking the question at one particular level of duration, like the average level of duration across the entire experiment, at that particular y-intercept, is the one cloud higher than the other one? So if you can actually tell your question in terms of like graphically what it actually represents, what you are thinking of in terms of the difference in activation when you are thinking that you are controlling for duration across the two conditions, in terms of what aspect of those clouds represent, then you can translate that into the particular contrast, how you will specify. You can specify different whatever question you can ask about those individual clouds and their slopes and their heights by specifying a particular contrast factor. And that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if that'll help.
So just to add something else related to that. So if you were to say, okay, I want to compare these two conditions at parameter equals 2 for both of them. Maybe maybe one of them has an average of 1.5 and one of them has an average of 2.5, but you want to compare the heights where they are both at 2. Would that be like a reasonable thing to do?
Yes, definitely. And you can actually specify one particular contrast weight across those four things that you are. So basically in that model, when you are allowing the slopes to be different across the two conditions, so basically when you are allowing the duration effect to be different across the two conditions, then you're going to end up with four things that are being estimated. Two of them are two height intercept and two of them are two slope variables. So you're going to have something like condition A, condition B, condition A times duration, condition B times duration. So you can actually specify a contrast vector across those four things that is going to have some weird numbers because those actual numbers depend on the average value of duration within each condition. But you can actually always specify one particular linear combination of those four things that represents whatever feature you want to ask graphically. If you want to ask the question of at the duration of 2, what is the difference in height between the two conditions? There is going to be some particular linear combination of those four numbers that the model is giving you that is going to effectively test that question.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And whether we would want to care about that.
Right, and how difficult to estimate those weights are depend on how do you define your first level analysis, because the same model, basically a model that computes allows the data to be fit across two clouds with different slopes can be fitted by different parameterization. So you can get like four values that mean different things depending on how you center the duration values, whether you center them differently, but to which values you center them. All of those choices about how you specify your first level design affect the simplicity or complexity of what are the computation of which particular ways will you need to use to specify that particular question that you care about.
So maybe we should figure out where to go from here. Just ignore it. Just don't do any of this.
I think we might have hit saturation.
Yeah,
for today.
that makes sense too.
I guess we already gave well, don't worry about this stuff. I think for your study, still might be interesting to see having it changed to this way of doing it, where you're really just removing the effect of the duration, but without removing it at all. Because I think I don't know about the
right the way
straight up task effect is without removing duration, because again it's sort of similar to Saul's.
Yeah, they're going to be related.
But we have a couple of times talked about something here that I think addresses the concern that we've had, which is where you're just removing the effect of this of a covariate that is common. So it's basically like you have the two clouds, they may have a different slope, and you are removing them. You're basically removing this part, right? And you can still look. The slopes can differ, and you leave that in there, but you remove. I guess you match the centroid. So is that what Alfonso was saying? Anyway, skip that part.
Yeah.
That thing. So we have to think about this some more, but we maybe have to pick it up think about it in the morning. But what I would say is I would suggest that to anyone doing this, write down what it is. Actually write some sentences that say, this is the thing that I want removed or accounted for or controlled for this reason.
Right, and generally when thinking about control variables, there are two things that you need to check to see whether it's a problematic variable. One is, does it affect your measure of interest? So in this case, it's something that potentially affects the ball signal. So is this particular variable that I care about, it's something that potentially I can justify a mechanistic way in which this affects the ball signal. And the second is, is it different across the things that I care about? So is it different across condition? Is it different across the two populations or whatever I'm testing about? And if the answer is yes for those two questions, then yes, that is a problematic variable that you potentially want to control for. So is it something that affects ball signal, and is it something that is different across the things that you care about in conditions, may that be conditions or groups or whatever?
And we can think about ways to illustrate this. Alfonso, I was thinking, one of the things that would be interesting to do would be to run to run this so that we look at, and we find a voxel that is significantly correlated, like strongly correlated with duration, say, from a data set, and then a voxel that has a task duration interaction, and then plot these clouds that you're talking about with slopes, and that we can refer to, so we can so that it's easier for us to follow along with.
Right.
And I think you had a slideshow that you presented before. I think it was during the second level analysis.
Right, because these questions also go to second level analysis, all of this control. And yeah, I have some slides that show that in like general terms, basically, how do you control for something at the second level model. But yeah, I mean, this is just like a revisitation of all of those complicated GLM issues, like at the level of the first level analysis, which is again another GLM. So that's why they appear here as well.
Could you send that around?
Yes, I mean, I think it's actually... perhaps it's on. I'll double check. Let me just write a quick note. GLM PowerPoint.
I think it may be around also.
Oh yeah.
I thought he sent it to us, but.
I think we got it.
Is it on? Oh,
Okay.
oh really?
I can look.
Yeah.
Right. So, do you guys have time to also look at the? I was interested in looking a little bit at the effect of the field maps on the M&I pipeline and all of that preprocessing. Do you have time for that, or do you want to? You're already tired and you want to change that for another day. What do you guys think? We went towards first level analysis. Talk a lot about that. So.
I would really like to wait for another day.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Okay. And I'm just judging by other people's faces. I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, start from new some different topic right now would be a little bit too much.
That's really good this meeting.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your willingness to do it when it's like 11 o'clock.
Yeah, it's actually 11 o'clock here. So
I'm sorry about that.
No, it really hit. I mean, we need to talk about this because, well, we already talked about. This is a big concern for these particular studies. They're not DIVA studies, they're GoDIVA studies. So that's trickier. So tomorrow, are people available? Can we meet as soon as tomorrow, or should we wait? After Friday, I think most of us are gone.
So
Or some of us are gone.
I mean, I will. It depends on what time of day it is, because part of it I will be in the air, so I won't have Wi-Fi per se. No, tomorrow. But I
We
can
can
also
record
just
it.
watch the recording.
Yeah.
Friday, I can also do it too. Yeah, are people gone on Friday?
I'm going Friday afternoon.
I'm fine with tomorrow.
I'm fine either. So.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can obviously Skype in on Friday. But,
Friday morning. I don't know.
Here, I think nobody's.
let's just do tomorrow, and I'll watch the recording
Okay,
if
yeah,
it's
that works.
during.
This is 4 hours of meetings. It's taking a toll.
Yeah.
Some of which included talk of two blanks and digitations.
Share.
Kind of a digitation.
Yeah, share.